everybody, and welcome to our next session here on the IGS. My name is Jan Bernecke from the editorial team, and I would like to introduce Jemima Abu, your host for the upcoming session. That will be all about React components and some helpful insights on how to style them. If you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A panel. And also, if you're facing any technical difficulties, please reach out via the chat so we can help you out. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to you, Jemima, and I hope you will all enjoy the session.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Jemima Abu, and today I'm going to be talking to you about React components and how to style them. So before we get into it, there we go. So I am a self-taught front-end developer and school-taught systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria, currently working at Telesoftis in Lithuania, which is fun. I'm currently on like a work trip at a lake house, so that's very fun. So, right, I'm going to be talking to you about React components. But before I get into it, I want to tell you the reason I wanted to give this talk. When I first started out with React, it was a lot different than what I was used to. I was used to HTML and CSS. And in HTML, if you want to style something, you just kind of like you either place it in an inline style or you just put it in a style tag, or worst comes to worst, you have a CSS file somewhere. And then I started with React and they were like, you can't just place your CSS files inside your React component. That's not how this works. And I was like, wow, okay. So yeah, for me, that was a rather interesting learning curve, figuring out how to style my components in React, which is the reason I want to give this talk, because I've used a number of components, a number of styling methods over the years. And basically, this is just like to say which I preferred and which was easier for me, and just a way to kind of like help people avoid, what's the word? Like the struggle I had to go through. Also, I have a poll in the thing where you guys are viewing this. So you can just go to the poll and then choose what your current styling method is. Basically, I'm just interested in knowing what kind of methods people use. If the method you use for styling your applications isn't listed there, you can just mention it in the chat, and then yeah, it'll be fun. Awesome sauce. So let's just get right into it. So I want to talk about some of the problems I faced when starting out with styling React components. One of them, and this was such a common one for me, was my styles would be getting overridden. So I'll be trying to nest components. I'd be importing a component from somewhere and then be trying to nest it somewhere else. And for some reason, the component would not maintain its styles when I've imported it somewhere else. It would get overridden by something else. So for example, let's say you have a main component here and you have a button with a class name active. I have a subcomponent that also has an active button. So now both of these buttons have the same class name, and when it renders, inevitably one of the class names is going to, and one of the styling methods is going to end up being chosen over the other one. And that was just such like, it was so annoying for me because I had to like figure it out a lot. And then I did get it at some point, but then before I did, it was like, no. Another thing was the layout problems. Sometimes there are CSS properties that do they don't work with other CSS properties. For example, a property with a fixed position does not work in a parent container who has a display flex set on it. So basically what that means is if because a fixed element is being removed from the flow of the page, but then flex kind of just displays everything on like a vertical line or horizontal line, depending. But the point is if you put a fixed component in a flex parent container, it's not going to enter the flow, and then that's going to break up your whole layout, and you're going to be like, why is this like this? So that's another reason, layout problems. And then naming classes is hard. So I know there are a lot of like naming conventions, like the BEM and the I only know the BEM, but I'm sure there are many more. But for me, it was just such a problem, especially when I had to be naming multiple components inside something. You have your main component and your subcomponent and your subcomponent content and your subcomponent subcontent, and it was just like it was a lot, and I did not I didn't really have the mental fortitude to deal with all of that. So yeah, that was another problem. And then targeting elements. So a lot of times because you have multiple elements listed, let's say you do have your actives and then you have active for the home page, active for the checkout page, active for the cart page. It's like you end up having to use a lot of class names to target each thing you're trying to get to. And then that can just be so stressful at the end of the day. So yeah, doing because of all these problems, I had like a list of like I had a list of points that I needed my style method to be able to do. One of the things is that it had to be easy for me to use or to learn. Basically, I didn't want something that would require a lot of back and forth to figure out how to use. I wanted something that I could pick up easily and then keep it up and running because I already knew CSS. I didn't want to spend more time learning how to use something else. It also had to be it had to like fit into my file structure. So at the company I work with currently, we use this design system called Atomic Design. So basically you break up your components into like atoms. Those are like the smallest components like buttons and stuff, and then you have your organisms, which are like more complex components like maybe combining two atoms basically. So I needed a styling method that could easily fit in the file structure. Like if I want everything related to a component to be inside one thing, so if I have like a button component, I should have button.css in the same folder, like things like that. I don't want to end up having components in one place and then all my styling methods in another place, and I'm having to figure out which one connects to which one. Something that was easily optimized by browsers. Obviously, every time you're building something, you want to get as high performance as possible, and I didn't want something that would take like a huge toll on my browser. I didn't want something that I would be downloading a module or library of like 500 kilobytes and I'm only using like 2 lines in it. So I didn't want that. I wanted something that was reusable and scalable. What this means is that something that could be applied to multiple components across the board. I wanted like if I style something, basically styles that I could export to multiple components, not that I style something for one component and it only applies to that component, if that makes sense. I wanted styles that could be like I just have a style and I can apply it to as many components as I need. So yeah, those were the methods those were my points for like an ideal choice of a styling method. So yeah, and then these are the methods that I have worked with over the years. I have used inline styling. I have worked with CSS style sheets. I've worked with CSS files, Sass and less, Tailwind, style components. Those are the CSS and JS modules, style components, and emotion. So throughout this talk, I'm just going to go through each of these methods as I use them and what I preferred about them and what I didn't like about them, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it'll be fun, hopefully. So yeah, to get right into it, inline styling. Inline styling was the very first method I used because it was the only method that didn't require me to figure out how to connect two files in React. Inline styling in React works slightly different than inline styling in HTML. It's still placed as an attribute within the elements tag. So it's still like just your style attributes and then you're passing the styles. But instead of being just like with quotes, it has to be encased in double brackets. And then your compound properties like background color or yada 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 have to be written in camel case as opposed to being hyphenated. So what that means is that if I'm trying to style a p tag, for example, I have to put it in double brackets. The reason for that is because one of the brackets is like the classic JSX syntax, and the second bracket is the object of styling you're passing to the elements. In React, you have to pass in your styles as objects as opposed to strings if you're just working with regular HTML. So yeah, I passed in the style and the color and the font size, and then that's pretty much it. It's an inline style. So inline styling rules, they can be passed to elements as object variables, and nested objects can be used for more complex styles. I'll explain what I mean in the next part. So here I have my object padding with border, and then it's just like an object with the value and key properties that I'm trying to style. And then I can pass this object to multiple elements on the page. So if I had this in a file, for example, I could just import it and then pass it to multiple elements. So this did check off my reusable reusable list thing. So yeah, and then you can also have nested elements. What that means is that you can have like a huge object and then you have like multiple styles inside it for each area you're trying to style. Basically, this was really good because it was a bit more specific than other was a bit more specific than just like writing the method in one style. So here I have my styles and then I have a header sub object and a content sub object. So if I'm trying to style the element, I just call that sub object and then yeah, it's great. So
I'm
that was
sorry,
it for
Jemima.
inline.
Could
Yeah.
you switch to your presentation?
Am I not on my presentation?
No, we're not seeing it right now.
Oh my God.
No worries.
Wow. Okay, great. Uh frack. Okay, give me a sec. Let me just figure out. Okay. Can you see it now?
Use cases, yes.
Wow. Okay.
No.
So fun fact, there was a whole bunch of stuff before that. You know what? I'm gonna just run through them real quick so y'all can actually see it. React components and how to style them. My name is Jemima Abu, self-taught developer, working at Telus office in Lithuania. What are React components? Why did I do this talk? I did this talk because I was trying to figure out how to solve my problems. One of the problems I had was overriding styles and nested elements. And now you can see the code. Layout problems, the whole thing with different display properties overriding other properties. Naming classes is hard. It was too much work trying to figure out how to name each and every class in what I was working on. Targeting elements, it gets real specific and it gets really bogus real quick. So my ideal style is easy to use or learn. It maintains file structure and code structure. It's optimized by browsers and it's reusable and scalable. These are the methods that I have used for styling React components over the years. That's inline styling, my CSS files, Sass and Tailwind, and then the CSS and JS methods, which are styled components and emotion. For inline styling, it pretty much works the same way as regular styling in HTML, but it has different syntax basically. You have to write it as an attribute, it has to be in double brackets, and compound properties have to be written in camel case. So that means for an inline style, this is how I would write it as opposed to just passing in the strings like I would do in regular HTML. So the first bracket serves as the JSX enclosure. So that's like when you're writing regular JSX, you usually put things in brackets to parse them. So that's what the first bracket's for. And the second bracket is for the actual object property, because in React, you have to pass in your styles as object properties. Inline styles can also be passed elements as object variables or nested objects for more complex styling. So here I have my object variable padding with border, and I've just defined the styles that I want as value and key properties, and I pass that object variable to the multiple elements. Then I have my more complex style, which is a nested object, which has like the main style and then the sub objects underneath it, like header and content, and I can just pass these sub objects to the specific elements that I want them to target. And then, okay, great. That was quick. That was a quick recap. So now we are caught up and use cases. What are the use cases for inline styling? So this is the point is that each of these methods, it's not like they're bad on their own or that they shouldn't be used, just that some of them have better use cases than others. So there are situations where you want to use one method over another method. The first situation for me with using inline styling is because I wouldn't use inline styling to style an entire React application. I don't have that much time. So, but there are certain situations where it's necessary to be used, something like overriding existing style rules, for example. In CSS, each style rule has a certain level of specificity. I have such a problem with that word. Each styling method has a level of specificity. See? And inline styles have the highest level as a right below like hashtag important, not hashtag, exclamation point important. So inline styles have the highest level, so they're really good for overriding existing style rules from, let's say, like your CSS file or somewhere else. And then you can also use them to pass in styling properties as props. What this means is that if you're collecting props from a parent container into a child container, one of those props can be inline styles. So in this case specifically, a lot of times, if you're trying to pass in a background image prop, from my experience, it's really hard passing a background image prop if you're not using CSS and JS or an inline style, because you can't passing a background image to your dots. You can't passing a prop to your .css file, for example. So the easiest way to pass it in would be to use an inline style or a CSS and JS library. And if you don't want to install, if you're not already using the CSS and JS library, but you do still want to have access to using certain styles as props, inline styling is your best bet for that. And then for conditional or dynamic styling, this is like for a real quick fix. If you don't want to like create a whole new class name or declare a whole new state toggling method, you can just easily set it like if your element is active, set display to block. If not, set display to none. So it's just a really quick way of easily setting your styles within your components dynamically. So yeah, the pros of inline styling, the reason I do like it is because it does not have any setup or learning curve. Inline stylings they just work the same way regular CSS styling works. You don't have to download anything. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to learn how to use any new frameworks. It works that way. And it does have very high specificity. What that means is that it's not going to have so many problems with getting overridden, and I don't need to target an element so much because I'm already setting the inline style, so I never need to target that element outside. But the cons of it is that it does have limited styling options. There are not a lot of things you can do with inline styling. For example, you cannot set a pseudo selector or you cannot set a hover effect with an inline style, and it does have payload costs. If you are writing inline styles for every single element in your page, it's going to render so much text in the DOM tree, and it's just going to be like, no, that's a lot. So yeah, that's it for inline styles. We're going to move on to CSS style sheets now. Sorry, you guys, just give me a sec. I really just want to make sure that I'm actually displaying the correct thing now. And I am. Great. Yeah, I kind of learned from that. Okay, so CSS style sheets. CSS style sheets are another common method of styling because it's the regular .css file or .scss file or less file that you're used to. How it works, examples of CSS style sheets are your CSS files or your CSS modules or your Sass and less files or Tailwind. I wasn't quite sure if I should put Tailwind under CSS style sheets because it does kind of work as a kind of like Bootstrap, because you have to import a utility and then you have access to all these utilities. So I don't know if I would call it a CSS style sheet or an external module, but I just put it in here anyway. So yeah, the first method with styling in React, you could just use a regular .css file. And how that works is that your file is written in the regular CSS syntax. So you just write it in your .css file the same way you write regular CSS. The CSS or equivalent file is imported in the React component. What that means is if you're using CSS or less or SCSS, you just import them in the React component using the imports keyword. Yeah. And then so basically this is how it would work. You have your app.css file and you could write all your beautiful, beautiful CSS code in whatever way you please, and it's great. The yeah. The use cases for that are grouping related content. So like I said, for me, I did like when I'm writing a React application, I prefer to have my CSS in the same folder as the component it's related to, just so it's easier for me to fix the problem. Basically, like if I want to fix something relating to this component, I don't want to have to start going to the styles folder and then scrolling down to find it. I just want to click on the component folder and find it easily. So I like it because it helps me group related content easier. It's also great for global styling. What that means is I can just have like one style. If I want to remove text decoration on all my anchor tags, I can just put that in an index.css file, import that in my general app.js file. Basically just have like pros as they do have similar pros to the CSS inline styling in that it is good for uh, okay, I
Hi.
seem to have lost connection for a bit. Am I back
Yeah,
on now?
we just lost you for a few seconds, but
Okay,
now
for
you're
a few
back.
seconds. Now I'm back. Great. Wow. Okay. Great. Okay, so I was talking about the pros of CSS files, which are that they give you access to all your CSS styling options and it's easily optimized. So it doesn't have as high of a payload as, let's say, inline styles, for example. So that's great. The cons of CSS files is that the files can become very large. What this means is that if you're putting in all your CSS styling inside one main file, or for example, you're compiling everything to one main file, it does become like very large, and then you kind of have to like scroll a lot to find the area that you're trying to target and style, and it's just kind of annoying. But if you are using like individual CSS files for each thing, then you do have to like include it in each component, and it does become, it's a bit more iffy, is the general point. And then it
I'm
also
sorry again. Could you share your presentation again, because we oops.
killing it today.
just
I am
just the last
killing.
5 seconds. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen.
Thanks.
Well, you know what? Sometimes things happen and you just keep it moving. Great. So yes, it does require setup for custom configuration, in that if you're trying to put a less file or a SAS file, you do have to set it up for that. And that was one of the things I was trying to avoid, because I just don't like having to like set up things or download things to do other things. So yeah, that's it for .css files. And then we have SAS. SAS is a CSS preprocessor. I'm not good with big words. How SAS works: your SAS files are imported in your React component, and the styles can be written in nested form or regular syntax. You can also use, basically, it's like you have access to all the benefits of SAS, and then at the end of the day, it still compiles to a CSS file. So you're still getting all the benefits from just using a regular .css file. The use cases for SAS: you could separate global variables using nesting. So at one of the companies I used to work for, this was how we used to separate our styles. So for example, let's say you have a main component, and that component is called main component A, and you have another component, that component is called main component B. Every time you want to style those components, just in case they have different styling methods, you just put everything inside you just nest them, basically. So you put everything inside the selector for your component A, or you put everything inside selector for your component B, and the styles would only apply to that component or that other component, because when they are compiled CSS, they would all have the prefix of that first component, if that makes sense. Yeah. So you can separate global variables using nesting, and basically it just has all the other properties, all the pros that regular .css files have. So I wouldn't go over that again. Oh, the sun is out. And then pros of preprocessors, including the ones from the CSS files, that you also have access to mixins and variables. What that means is that you can pass in all your magic.css, where you call all your, what you call it, you can style your keyframes however you want them, or you can set up your all those prefixes that things have, like a transform, old transform, WebKit transform. You can Moz transform. You can set all of that in your mixin or your variables, and it's great. The cons of preprocessors is that the high specificity of elements can cause conflicts, because even though you are getting a lot of specificity, because you are trying to, let's say you're trying to style one class name across multiple elements, and then at some point that class name ends up having a higher specificity. I'm gonna try to avoid saying that word because it just slows my brain down. That class name has a higher specific value than another place where you're calling it from. It could cause like overriding problems. I kind of don't want that. So yeah. And then Tailwind. Tailwind, I just started using recently at the company I work with. I hadn't actually used it before, because I was always very anti modules. When I first started, I did not want to use Bootstrap at all. I was like, no, why would you use a utility? The fun of CSS is to write your own code from scratch. And then you start working with a project that has like 50 different components that need to be styled differently, and you're like, yeah, I'll take the utility. I have nothing to anyone. So yeah, oh dear. I just realized I think my internet is shaky. So I hope it
Yeah, we
doesn't log
just
me out again.
lost you again.
Yeah.
Maybe if you switch off your camera, maybe that helps for a second,
Oh,
maybe.
so no camera? Okay. Yeah, sorry
Maybe it
y'all.
will help.
I am at a lake house, and
No worries, but
this
we
was not
do see your
planned.
presentation.
So okay, oh, the presentation is the important part. You guys have seen enough of my face. Yeah. So okay, hopefully this is better. And please just let me know if you can't see anything or hear me anymore. So yes, Tailwind. Tailwind is a utility first framework. How that means is that the elements are described as utilities, basically. So if I want to target an element, I would call in a class name. For example, let's say we have there's a border class name. The border class name is it has a styling of says border to 1px solid. So what that means is for every time I want to style something, I'm just going to call all the different class names for that styling, and then it will just apply to all of them. So properties are applied based on class names, and the utilities are fully customizable. So you can have your tailwind.config.js file where you define all your own utilities, or you can change it. You can change your things like your spacing or your theme colors or yada yada yada. Tailwind is, it's kind of a lot, but it's also kind of good. It just depends on your personal preference. The use cases for Tailwind is building simple reusable components. So for example, here I have a class BG Blue 500. What this is going to do is just set a background of blue, and it's going to be the blue based on the 500 value that I have described um, in my utilities folder, my config folder. And then I have, you can also set your hover properties. I can set text white. This is just going to give all my text white colors. Font bold, it will just bold it. Padding white 2. This is going to give it a padding top and bottom of 2. So the 2 is usually based on like an REM value, a PX4, and then rounded. Rounded is just like for the border. So it's, this is basically how it works, yeah. And then you can customize your utilities to create your design systems. If you do work in an organization that uses similar designs across multiple projects, it's really great because that way you don't have to, let's say you don't have to reinstall your colors or your padding or your font sizes across all those multiple projects. You can just import the tailwind.config file, and all those projects will have the similar styling. And also, if you want to change anything, let's say you want to change your organization's theme color from hashtag FFF to hashtag FFE, you don't have to start going around all the projects and changing it. You just need to go to the tailwind.config file and change one value there. So it's actually really cool for creating design systems. So yeah, the pros of Tailwind is that there's no naming convention because everything you're using is a utility and it's a predefined class name. You don't have to think of, oh, this has to be main component, subcomponent A, subcomponent B. You just call the class name and that's how it works. It's also good for reusable components because technically you are not redefining your styles anywhere. You are just calling the class names that you want to apply to that component. So it's also cool for that. The cons of Tailwind is that it has a very high learning curve. Honestly, I think it took me 2 days to figure out how to get the Tailwind set up. Maybe that's just a reflection on me personally, and it takes other people less time, but it took me so long to figure out how to get it set up and how to get it to work and how to get the config files to work. And then there are so many class names because with Tailwind, you are trying to style elements using class names as opposed to using the properties as class names as opposed to just passing in one class name that has all the properties. You're going to end up writing a lot of class names if you want to apply a lot of properties to one element. And then you have to repeat it for every single element on the page. So it does get tiresome sometimes. But then if you are working in a system that the payload is going to be worth it, because even though you are using a lot of class names, it's also saving you on a lot of time you would have spent importing multiple variables and everything, then it's kind of like a toss-up, you know. So yeah, that is it for Tailwind. And then we have the CSS and JS. I do remember when CSS and JS came out, and then it's like, wait, I saw this funny joke on Twitter. Someone was like, if there's CSS and JS, then Tailwind is, honestly, I cannot remember the joke. Honestly, I should have screenshotted it. It was funny when I saw it. Anyway, okay, I think they said Tailwind is HTML in CSS or something like that. It was funny anyway. So yeah, CSS and JS. CSS and JS are basically just libraries or frameworks that allow you import your CSS files, your CSS style options as JavaScript properties, basically. And when this first came out, when I first heard about it, there were so many articles that were like, why CSS and JS is a bad thing and why you should always keep your styling separate from logic and everything. And then I was on that boat too. I was like, oh yeah, I don't want to write CSS and JavaScript. CSS and JavaScript are different files. And then I had to start importing file multiple files across multiple components, and I'm like, please give me the CSS and JavaScript. Yes. So fun fact about this thing is that you get to learn and you get to make your own choices. There are people who don't like CSS and JavaScript for some reason, and it's cool because that's their project and that's how they want to go along with it. But I'm just hoping that I will provide you guys with like kind of the option so that you kind of know which you prefer and which you don't prefer. Also, if in the chat you could tell me, I think I've seen a lot of some responses for which styling method you currently use. So if you haven't filled out the poll, you can go fill it out now. And also, you could just tell me in the chat while you use the styling method that you currently use and why you prefer it, or if you are looking to use another styling method. So that'd be great. Thank you. Back to my slides, which hopefully you guys can still see, for CSS and JavaScript. CSS JavaScript libraries, we have things like, oh yeah, so that's the JSS I was talking about earlier. We have things like style components, emotion, and JSS. I only use the first two, but I did mention JSS because I liked the name basically. It just seemed like a good name. So styled components. How style components work. CSS is written as JavaScript template literals. That's that little angular quotation mark thing. And then it compiles to a HTML element with the class name. What this means is that when you write your CSS JavaScript as template literals, when it renders in the DOM, it's going to be assigned like a random class name, and that random class name is going to have all these styling properties that you have just defined. So the use cases for style components is for styling elements. Style components are really great, and I really like them because they help you keep your elements semantic. A lot of times when you're styling things, it may be tempting to use like a div tag everywhere because you don't want to start thinking about how to like override the button style or something like that. But with style components, they allow you style that element, and you can also use they have like this AS prop that allows you to change the how do I put it? Basically, I could have like a styled button as an anchor tag, basically. So it's going to render as an anchor tag, but it's going to have all the, or I could have an anchor tag as a styled button. It's going to render as a button, but it's going to have all the designs of the anchor tag, if that makes sense. So hopefully it's a really great way of like keeping your elements semantic and not having to deal with overriding all the native properties that would come with the semantic elements. So yeah, you just have here, you have your styled div and it's called container, and I have my styled p tag and it's just called styled p. And then I call the container as the HTML element itself. When this renders in the DOM, it's just going to be a regular div tag, and it's going to have a random class name that has all these properties there. The same thing with the styled p tag. So the pros of style components is that it's great for complex styling. You can do as many things as you want, as many JavaScript properties as you want in your CSS. You can pass in your props. You can use your dynamic styles. You can use your conditional styling. You can use themes as well, like themes across your project. In case you have like, let's say, a dark and a light theme, you can just pass it to your theme provider, and when the state is toggled, you can easily just update the theme. So it's really great. There are no naming conventions because everything you're defining is just a styled element. You don't need to think of like a class name, which is another reason I really like it. And it does have inbuilt accessibility with semantic HTML. What that means is that because you are calling these elements using their semantic names, you're going to get all the accessibility features of the semantic elements. And accessibility is something that's also very important when you're building a site, and you should always think about it. The cons of style components is that there's a bit of a learning curve. It's not as complicated as I thought it would be when I was dreading learning it, but there is still a bit of a learning curve because you still have to set things up and everything. But it's really not as bad as I thought it was going to be. So yeah, I do have a demo. I have a demo, and the demo is just basically code that it's basically just me styling multiple elements using all these methods. So I'm just going to run you through it just so you can kind of see the layout of each of these things. I'm going to show you the code first, and then yeah, I think that's basically all we're going to show. This one. Okay, so hopefully you can see this screen now. I will zoom in a little. Yeah, zoom in. I know there's a shortcut for this, but I can't figure out where the plus button on this laptop is. Like, I just could not find it. And I'm like, yeah, just gonna do it this way. Okay, perfect. So we have our app here, and each app has its own method of styling. We have the inline, the style sheet, the Sass, the Tailwind, and the style components. So the first one we use is the inline styling. That's just this one where we literally just say, well, it's a component. So we're gonna go to it. So we have our inline props. I'm using React hooks. You have your inline props, and then so that's I'm using React hooks and TypeScript, which I'm using an interface. This basically, I just passing a background color string, and then I have my is active and my set active and my use state. What I'm doing here is just I am triggering the value after I'm changing the display property basically after 5 seconds. And then I have my styles here as I want them to look. Padding styles header. So let me show you what this looks like in the what you call it, the DOM. I'm just gonna comment those out. Okay. Give me a second to figure out where I put that. It looks like I closed it. Yeah, let's open my local host. Make sure it's 3000. Yep. And then I'll share this. So this is what, this isn't the point of the style, but the point is just that in the inline style, you can see here that it renders the regular components that I defined, and then the styles that I passed in as objects are just inside that component. I do hope my lighthouse is showing because I have learned from sharing screens. Let me just check if it's showing again. Okay, yes, it's showing. So you have your div and then you just have your style and everything is just defined as the style inside. But the problem with that is that if this was a very complicated application, you're going to end up having so many of these things and so much more text. And this is just for like the simple ones. Imagine when you start doing fancy things like sticky and absolute positioning and top left, right, bottom 0. So the point is that this will take up a lot of space in your DOM tree, and we kind of don't want that. But for the purpose of what it is, it's really useful for just the basic styles. So that's it for inline. We're going to go back to, unless I could just share my whole screen, but I've had issues with that in the past, so I have trust issues now. So I'm going to do it like this. And now for the style sheets. The style sheets is just a regular way of styling CSS. Your regular way of styling CSS by passing in your CSS style sheets, and we can go to that component here. So literally, this is just my components. It's just a div, and it just has the class name the same way I would have done it in HTML. And I'm importing the index.css file. You can see in my folder here, I have my component file, and I have my index.css file. So everything is inside. And this is a style component, and it's just like the same way you would write regular CSS. And this would also render on the page in the exact same way. Then for so this one, when it renders on the page, it would just have a class name, and that class name would be linked to the CSS file, as opposed to everything being inside the DOM tree. So that's it for the style sheet. Same thing with Sass. This demo was meant to be me writing code, but when I tried it last time, I did not have nearly enough time. It took like the entire talk duration. So that's why I'm just showing you the already written code. So yeah, you have your Sass file, and it's the same thing with your index.css. You just need to pass it in. The difference is that when you're using Sass, you do need to import a particular package to be able to yeah, you need to import a particular package to be able to build your Sass. Yeah, so you need like node.sass, but it's really cool because that's the only thing you need. And then you don't need to like run a preprocessor or anything because everything just builds once you start your file. So it's great. So that's it for Sass. And then we have Tailwind. So like I said, this is how Tailwind works. This was like the most basic example I could find, but if you go to the Tailwind sites, they do have a lot more complex examples there. This was the most basic example I could write. You can still write your, so this is what the entire Tailwind utilities compile to. So the thing is, you do have to still uncompile all of them. And if you're not using a lot of the utilities, look at that. It's like 86,854 lines of CSS. So if you're not using all of that, yeah, it might be a lot, especially if you don't need all of that in your Tailwind. But there's also a particular package that works with Tailwind. I can't remember the name now, but we do use it in my company. So what it just does is that it goes through your code and it looks at all the Tailwind utilities that you have used, and it just only renders those ones. It doesn't render the use at purge.css, that's the name. So it only renders the Tailwind utilities you've actually used, and it doesn't render the ones you don't need. So it's great. Oh, my bad. I have how many minutes? 40. So I have like 2 minutes left. Okay, great. I will just go through. So that's it for Tailwind. And then finally, we have the styled components, which are my favorite. So like I said, it's just a const styled, and then it's the same way you would do an inline style, but just like slightly more advanced because you don't need to use objects per se. You're just using template literals. So I just passing my style.div and my style.p, and then everything. Okay, let me just show you how this would render in the DOM. If I passing styled, yep. Can you share React app? Sure. So yeah, this is what the style component looks like. And then in the DOM, this is where it renders that. So I passed in the style div, and it just has like this random little name here, and it has all the stylings. And my styled P as well, still rendered as P, but then with all these random stylings. So yeah, it's really cool. And then we can just go back to the code, and I will just do the little comparison thing that I did at the end, because I still need to figure out which was my actual preferred method. Why can't I see my presentation? Okay, here it is. Oh, okay. I'm sharing my Chrome screen so you guys can see this. Yes. Yes, you can. So that was the demo. I was doing finger quotes around demo, but I didn't realize my video was turned off. That was the demo. Hope that was useful. And then this was just like the little comparison thing I had at the end. Like I said, this is just like my personal preference and opinion. It does not necessarily relate. It does not necessarily reflect on the actual method or on how other people might view it. It's just how I found it. So for me, I would say my most preferred method was actually CSS files, but my most used method was the method that met most of my criteria was CSS files. But personally, my most preferred is style components or emotion, just because of the easiness. And that thing with style components actually that you don't need to create a whole new file for it. So I still have my styles within my components. So I still have the easy way of changing a style without having to go to a folder to find everything. But then I don't need to create another file for it because everything is inside that component. So yeah, so for ease of setup, and my least preferred method was Tailwind, but that was just because I found it so hard to use. For what it does, like for the purpose you want to use it for, if you're trying to create a company-wide design system, for example, is great, and I would definitely recommend it. But just for me personally, if I was building like a small application or just a client-based application that didn't really need that much constant design, yeah, then I just wouldn't use Tailwind. So yeah, that's about that for that. I do have some resources here on further methods for styling with React components. They are really cool and really useful. You could just check them out. I think I would share the slides after, or I'll send it to the conference, and then they'll probably share it to you guys. Hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, like aside from the questions you're going to ask in the chat, if you just want to ask anything later, you could send me a message from my website, jemimaabu.com. You could just go to my contact form there and fill it out. Or you could hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn at Jemima Abu, and I'd be glad to chat with you there. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn my video back on. Hopefully it would not break the system again. So yes, thank you so much for listening. I'm going to go through the chats now and see if there are two chats. Okay. And see, okay, the responses from the polls. It looks like most people use CSS files and everyone else uses CSS and JS. So nobody uses Tailwind? Well, I feel like I didn't give Tailwind a very good rep during this talk, but hopefully somebody will try it out later and they'll mention it. So yeah, I'd love to take any questions you have. I think I still have 3 minutes left for that. So let me have it.
Many thanks for your talk, Jemima.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have real applause like we would have on a physical conference, but
Oh, that was amazing.
what you can do is leave Jemima a message in the chat and rate her talk at Swapcount. So I think Jemima would be around a few minutes more.
Yeah, I
for
still
the
have
chat.
2 minutes, looks like.
Yeah, you can also stay a bit longer if you like to, and if there are any questions.
Thank you. Thank you guys for watching and tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it.
Right. So thanks from me again, and I hope you have a wonderful day at the IGS, and maybe see you in one of the next sessions.
Hopefully in person, yes.
Yes. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.